here. It looks like Jim was the only one that was signed up for the general public comment.
Okay. Well, in that case, we'll go ahead and close public comment. We're going to have an additional public comment period specifically on the FY21 Transit Development Plan, but we want to give Martin an opportunity to brief us and members of the public who are here about some of the changes. Going into this, I do want to say that I think we all breathe a sigh of relief knowing that the CARES Act money, and we'll be talking about this when we get down to Evan's report in finance a lot more, but we really were saved. And, you know, the report for this board meeting outlines some of the very tough choices that we would have had to make. And thankfully, you know, as our country considered priorities, transit was one of them, and understanding that we have to keep our systems solvent and that we have benefited greatly from the money that has come to this region. And that has allowed us to continue to do what it is we do in terms of providing critical service to people. So, you know, very grateful as we head into that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Martin.
And Martin, I think I'm going to be able to give you, let me just check here. I might be able to give you quick advanced remote control here. Give me just a moment.
And Josh, just while we do that, I want to give some thanks to Steve Kleist, who last night called me with an excellent suggestion for how we could manage folks on the call wanting to be recognized, since the 9 of us are unmuted and can sort of talk at any time. And unfortunately, just because of my technical limitations on my end, we're not going to be able to do it. But it was essentially having, because I can't see the gallery feature where we have everybody all at once, but it was essentially having people hold up a pen or a pencil on the video to indicate that they wanted to be recognized. So that way we weren't talking over each other if there were delays. And Steve had said that in his work, having been on a lot of these calls, that works very well. Unfortunately, just because I can't see all of you, I can only see the person who's presenting. So right now I just see Josh on my screen. We won't be able to do that, but just ask that we try to be mindful about, you know, being careful that, you know, we're not trying to talk over each other, since we just can't see one another and we can't kind of tell who's doing that. But that way, then we can kind of have a productive meeting. And, you know, this is new to all of us, but I did want to thank Steve for that suggestion.
That is a good idea. And I'll keep an eye out on the grid window for you, David. So okay. I can see if we've got somebody. So Martin, do you have control here? Are you able to drive the screen?
I don't believe I am, but I only have about 4 slides, so maybe I can just get you to advance them as needed.
All right, so everyone should see the Transit Development Plan intro slide on your screen at this point.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Martin Barn, Director of Planning and Scheduling for DASH. So we have our virtual public hearing for the FY21 TDP Transit Development Plan this evening. I did want to just provide a very brief refresher on what the TDP is this year and what we're proposing, just to make sure that anyone who wanted to provide comments would have the appropriate information so that they could provide feedback. Josh, if you could advance it, please. Just very briefly, we all know that the TDP is an annual document that DASH prepares. It outlines our proposed service and fare changes for the upcoming fiscal year. In this case, it's FY21, which begins in July. This is directly tied to our budget request from the city, which goes through a parallel city budget process. The TDP is approved by the DASH board of directors. The city budget is approved by the city council. We kind of focus on FY21 for that reason, because its budget is tied to the budget, but we also do look at service and fare changes for the subsequent 5 years, which would be FY22 to 26. Next slide, please. So for service change proposals, we don't have a whole lot that we're proposing. We only have one major change. The reason that we're trying to keep things relatively stable in FY21 is because of the ATV, which we are anticipating. That's the Alexandria Transit Vision Plan. We're anticipating that we will be implementing phase 1 of the ATV in FY22. So we're trying to keep things relatively stable and flat in FY21 so that we're not making changes and undoing them 1 year later, or just to avoid confusion. So to that end, we only have two changes to note here. One is an improvement to our holiday service. Currently, we only operate the trolley on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. Our regular DASH routes do not operate. This proposal would change that so that we run all routes on Sunday service, which is consistent with a lot of our other regional partners, including Wamada. It also recognizes that there are still people that need to get around on those days, and we want to make sure that we're there for them. So that's a positive thing. The other change that we want to highlight is the At4 route change. This proposal would discontinue service from Braddock Road Metro to City Hall, effective in the fall. Josh, if you could advance the next slide, I have a map of this. Thank you. So this map shows a portion of the At4 route. The At4, for those that don't know, is a longer route. It runs during weekday peak periods only. It's a commute-oriented route. Goes from City Hall up through North Old Town into Braddock Road Metro, and then onto Park Fairfax, Northridge, and onto the Pentagon via 395. So the majority of the riders of the At4 are commuters who are traveling from Park Fairfax and Northridge up to the Pentagon and back each day. They're not shown on this map. Those folks would not be directly impacted. They wouldn't be impacted by this proposal. The impact is primarily in Old Town. You can see the dark red, it shows the At4, and the dashed part of the At4 is the part that is proposed for discontinuation. We estimate that there are approximately 50 daily boardings on the At4 along this dashed portion. You'll notice that there is another route, the At8, shown in green, that also operates along that exact same alignment. It operates all day, 7 days a week, so much more span than the At4. And we believe that that is an alternate route that could be used by those 50 or so passengers that are impacted by this proposed discontinuation. One note about the At8 and the At4, they both run every 20 minutes during the peak periods. However, due to a lot of different factors, they were not able to coordinate the schedules as much as we'd like to. So ideally, you'd have two routes running every 20 minutes. You'd have them coming, one bus coming every 10 minutes. Unfortunately, due to some other factors, we have these two buses and they're often running very close to one another, often 2 to 3 minutes apart. And so, that's obviously not a great thing, but in this case, it means that the impact of removing the At4 service is not as significant because, if you miss that second of the two buses that come back to back, currently you have about maybe a 15 to 17 minute wait. If we remove the At4, you have a 20-minute wait now. So not a huge difference in that aspect. Also, since we have the real-time information available, it would make it easier for someone to just look for the At8 and they would just ultimately just have to go out to the bus stop a few minutes earlier, a few minutes later. So there would be some inconvenience there for sure, but the impact is not as significant as it might otherwise be. The one other impact of this is for riders, there's about 10 to 15 daily riders that ride through the Braddock Road Metro station on the At4. These would be people coming from Park Fairfax going into Old Town or something like that. These folks would still be able to make their trip. However, they would need to make a transfer now at Braddock Road Metro. They could easily transfer to the At8, which would be a very easy transfer since they both run every 20 minutes and they are aligned, or many other routes like the At2, the At5, Metrobus 10A or 10B. So there's a lot of different options for transferring. So hopefully that would be a minimal inconvenience and a relatively easy transfer. So that's the impact. The reason that we're proposing to do it, in this year, we had this change is included in the ATV for FY22. So we're effectively just moving it 1 year earlier. And the reason that we're doing it is as a way to meet our subsidy reduction target for the city. The city has asked us to come up with ways to reduce costs, and this was before COVID. And so this was something that we came up with that has a relatively high amount of savings compared to the relatively low passenger impact, at least in our estimation. And hopefully we'll hear from some other folks about the passenger impact as well in the hearing portion. So that's the At4. Next slide, Josh. Please, thank you. So the fare changes, we don't have too much proposed on the fare side. Base fares are not changing. We are extending our Dash Bus mobile ticketing app pilot through next spring. That will allow us some additional time to evaluate it and to coordinate with Metro and other regional partners to make sure that we're kind of heading in the direction that's best for the region. We also have a couple potential fare changes that involve Wamada. These were included in Wamada's final adopted budget that was passed a few weeks ago. However, due to the COVID situation, they're still a little bit up in the air as to if they will be implemented in FY21 or when in FY21 they'll be implemented. And the changes are more Wamada joint fare products with Dash. So currently there is one joint fare product, which is the 7-day regional pass. It's available for use on both Dash, Metrobus, and other regional bus providers, but not rail. So they're looking to expand some of those pass offerings to include Metro Rail, but also to have different durations like 1 day, 3 days, a month. So there'd be additional offerings that would encourage people that want to ride transit using both Dash and Wamada. And on a similar note, we're also, Wamada is planning to increase their transfer discount that they offer. Currently, when you transfer from Dash to a Metro Rail, it's a 50-cent discount on your fare. They're proposing that would be increased to $1, and they didn't include that in their budget. But again, we're not sure when that will actually be implemented. So we are including a reciprocal on our side, where currently they only pay $1.50 when they come from Metro Rail on Dash. Now they would only pay $1. So should hopefully encourage ridership. We believe it will. We've run the numbers and we're comfortable with what the impact will be. So that's why it's included here. Next slide, please. So very briefly, just the timeline. We started this back in March, our public comment period for our draft TDP. We obviously had to shift things around a little bit based on the COVID situation. We did have a community meeting virtually last Wednesday. We had good participation, about a couple dozen participants, I think it was 8 to 10 questions. It's on Facebook Live and it was recorded. We have about 200 or so views that have occurred since last week of the video. So very happy with those results. So now we've got our public hearing tonight. The board will hear the feedback. We have another, Josh, I believe we have another meeting on May 27th where the board can provide some additional feedback based on the public input that's received. And then the final version of the TDP would be presented to the board June 17th for final adoption. So that's kind of the updated timeline that we're working off of. And I think the last slide, Josh, is just a list of how you can provide feedback. Again, please submit feedback as early as you can so we can make sure we can incorporate it. But that's the presentation. So I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chairman, for the public hearing.
Thanks, Martin. Before we start the public hearing, are there any questions from board members to Martin that we need to address? And I'll just ask, as we said, just try to signal for recognition. I'll actually have Josh call on you since he can see all of you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm not seeing any hands up. I just would also make sure the board members understand that, this is such a unique circumstance. Normally, it would be much more accessible as far as the public hearing is concerned. So we've made sure that these various venues and ways that people can submit written feedback, we collect that and we will make sure that that is passed on to you all for your information, since we have to kind of juggle this process a little differently. So we'll certainly still have time to accommodate that.
And I think Whitney has written that there is no public comment or no one has signed up for the public hearing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's so she would put in this chat. Yeah, if there was anybody signed up. The only item there was just a follow-up comment from Jim Durham. That I think that was from his previous comments.
Okay, so we will be adopting the TDP and our budget at our next meeting. So there's no action required tonight other than to provide staff any feedback that we have as we finalize. We've heard this a couple of times already. Thankfully, it hasn't changed due to adjustments because of the funding that we're receiving. But we don't actually take action tonight. This will come back to us one more time for adoption, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. So are there is there any feedback from staff or any questions anyone has?
Not seeing any.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Martin. Next order of business is the adoption of our meeting minutes. We have two minutes. We have our regular meeting of March 11th, and then we had the Zoom emergency where we had the declaration of emergency. That was the meeting held on March 19th. The minutes are in your packet. I have asked for clarification because for the March 19th meeting minutes, we don't have any of the, normally we record all our visitors because people sign a sign-in sheet, and we didn't capture that for March 19th. But apparently with the setup that we have now, everybody who is logging into the meeting, their names are captured, and so will be part of the record. So we should have that for this meeting and any other virtual meetings going forward. But are there any corrections or amendments to the minutes?
David, while the board considers that, I might offer an option as far as the voting. Certainly you need to have someone go ahead and offer a motion and a second, but you could also offer for people to vote only by dissension, meaning that a silent vote is a yes, and if anyone wants to abstain or dissent from that vote, to then speak at that point after. It's
That's
another
fine
way
with
of
me,
managing it, if that helps.
Does anybody else, are there any objections to doing that? I guess otherwise we'd have to have a roll call vote.
So you just need someone to offer. You just need someone to offer the motion and the second.
Okay. Well, we'll take both sets of minutes in one motion if somebody's willing to offer that.
Sure, I offer it. I move to adopt the minutes from both meetings as described by the chair.
Okay, thank you,
I'll
Matt.
second.
Second, Carrie. Since there were no amendments or changes, so I'm to ask if anybody is anybody dissenting from this vote or abstaining?
This is Hillary. I would abstain since I was not at those meetings.
That's fair. Okay, Hillary. Okay, so Hillary has abstained and everybody else has voted in favor. Next order of business are the board member announcements and business items. So I'll start with my report. Primary item is just to update on the board member selection committee. As everyone recalls, we had we have potential to add 2 additional members to our board. These are seats that council authorized at our last stockholder meeting to ensure that we had representation from all facets of the community. At our March meeting, we had some volunteers to serve on the committee, including Jim, Jeff, and Matt. Matt subsequently has asked to be removed from the committee because he knows a couple of the people who had applied. We received 9 applications. Hillary was kind enough, upon joining the board, I immediately asked her if she would serve on the committee as well. So we were able, with Matt's removal, to get back to a 3-member committee. And what I decided to do, because of just the sort of environment we find ourselves in, and knowing that council had identified this as a priority and wanting to move quickly, is I asked the committee if they would not only do what they normally do, which is to go through the initial review of applications and recommend those who are well qualified, but to actually decide who to interview and conduct those interviews and come back to us with a recommendation as to who we should seat, whether it be 1 person or 2 people. And right now we're scheduled to meet again on May 27th, and I'd asked the committee if they would complete their work by then. My understanding is the committee has already started and had a meeting this week, and I just wanted to ask if Jim, Jeff, or Hillary, if either of you want to give an update to the board just in terms of where you're at in that process.
Sure. So as you mentioned, Jim and Hillary and I met. We met yesterday, so we appreciate Hillary. Sorry, not Hillary. Kelly for setting that up for us. Of the 9, we've narrowed it down to 4 candidates, so it's a very good, diverse pool. And we have working to schedule interviews for next week. So hopefully by the May 27th meeting, we'll have the recommended panelists.
That's great. Thanks to all 3 of you for agreeing to take that on, and we look forward to hearing your recommendation. It's something for the board that I've sat now a few times when we've gone through this process where we've all been around the table and we've asked questions of applicants, and I feel like it may be a little intimidating for people with so many of us kind of there looking at them from across the table, that it perhaps inhibits some of the kind of free flow of conversation that you really want as you try to get to know someone. So I'm hopeful if this is a successful process that we consider as we have future recruitments doing it this way going forward. And, we'll, of course, rotate the committee, and we'll make sure that we have a good cross-section of the board as we do this time. And, I think that could be helpful for us to have just a means of having a little bit more of a free-flowing conversation with our applicants. And so I'm really excited to hear about how those interviews go, and if this is something we want to continue to do in the future. I also wanted to note that I had talked with Carrie Donnelly, who's on the call tonight. This was originally going to be Carrie's final board meeting, as he had announced earlier in the year that he was going to retire from the board. Carrie has agreed graciously to remain on the board until we seat his replacement. And initially we thought that was going to be in the fall, because the city manager had said that council was pretty much for the remainder of this year, before they go in summer recess, that they were not going to take up anything non-COVID related. But in a subsequent conversation Josh had with the manager, it seems that now, starting in June, and there's one legislative meeting in July, that council is willing to be a little more flexible in terms of their scheduling. And Mark acknowledged that this was something that council had raised in February as being very important to them, that we fill those seats. So if the committee reports out at the end of May, we will then, and we vote on their recommendation at that time, we will find out whether this will be heard in June or July. And so potentially we would have our new board members appointed by summer, and then in September we would be able to seat them. But that gives Carrie at least one more meeting with us, and we're very grateful for his service and his agreement to stay with us at a time that is just kind of unprecedented, and continue to offer us his knowledge and experience. But that's kind of where we are with the board member selection committee. So more to come on that at our next meeting. But thanks to all three of you. Let's see, I think I had one more item. Oh, I did want to also, and this is important too, just commend Josh and his staff for the employee communication and engagement. It's an area that we have talked about a lot as a board, in terms of our concern for, how information is shared with our workforce, and how, our workforce is, sort of what the culture is at Dash. And these are, of course, extraordinary times. Josh has convened virtual town hall meetings through Zoom and Facebook Live to ensure, on Saturday mornings, to ensure that information is shared with the workforce about safety, about operations, in terms of HR policies and new laws that have come out really as it relates to leave. The health department director has participated in that, and also ATU 689's president and their business manager were both on those calls. So they've had two of these now, and they're archived on Facebook Live. And I would recommend, if you have some time, take a look at these meetings, because it really was a very good exchange of information with the workforce. And I'm really glad that we are being a leader in terms of ensuring that our workforce knows that we're trying to take care of them, we're trying to maintain essential service, and that we're there to hear their comments and to answer their questions. I know that's going to be an ongoing effort, because this is going to go on for several more months. Josh mentioned that if you look at the number of views on Facebook Live, it far exceeds the size of our workforce. And what some of that is, at least, are others in the transit industry who have been looking at how Dash has been handling this, to kind of figure out how they should be messaging their employees. So job well done. I know we'll hear more about this in Josh's report. That's what I had. Hillary has her first TNES report, and we also have a written report that she sent as well. So I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you. Okay, so how can you guys let me know how Jan used to do this? Do you like to go one at a time and then take questions, or should I go through all of them and then we can, if there's any questions, follow up at the end?
I think it's, what do you feel most comfortable with?
Whatever you guys are used to, I'm happy to that. It's fine.
Okay, well, why don't you go through them? If there are, we can have most of the questions at the end, but if there's something, a clarifying question somebody wants to ask as we go through, that's fine too.
Sure, and if Josh, you can see people, you can just call on them if there's a question.
Sure
okay.
thing.
the first one to note is the Potomac Yard Metro Station update. Construction has continued. There were some pauses with COVID, and council has approved moving forward with the modified concept number 1 for the southwest access. So this does include a bridge that connects to the northern entrance, and this is an option that can be fully funded by the $50 million in the state funding that was committed as part of the Amazon package. Questions on that? Okay, so I have a brief bit on the CARES Act, although I think Evan's going to touch on this more later in more detail. But the CARES Act did provide the Washington metro area with about $1 billion for the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is so that local jurisdictions would not have to become federalized to receive the funds. So the Wamada is actually, they agreed to allocate 82 million of this funding to the jurisdictions in the form of a subsidy credit on their July 1st Wamada bill. So what this means for Dash is that Alexandria is receiving a little over $6 million, and this is the funding is intended to pay for the increased transit agency costs that were borne due to COVID-19, and this is also available for compensation for lost revenue that Dash has suffered. So this is really, really good news for Dash, and we can talk more about that with Evan's financial report. The Wamada 2021 budget, they adopted their budget. Martin touched on this a little bit. Some of the highlights included the $2 weekend flat fare, the transfer discount of 50%. And the only real bus changes in Alexandria is the reduction in the service level of the NH2, which will now terminate at King Street instead of Huntington. And as part of this, the approved budget, there was an expectation that it might be revisited in June when more is known about the pandemic. MBTA 6-year improvement plan. So MBTA is now hosting a virtual public hearing on the 6-year improvement plan, and that is on May 14th. So the dashboard actually submitted a letter of support for the one project that the city submitted for this funding, which was the Duke Street Transitway, and that was for fiscal year 24-25 funding. So the people, if anyone wants to testify on behalf of the city for that funding, they must pre-register by May 11th to do so. I believe there will be someone from the Transportation Commission that is going to testify. And then lastly, the electric vehicle charging infrastructure readiness study is now available online, and people are able to provide comments on that study. And I believe there was a presentation on this at an earlier meeting, I think, with Dash. But this is really just a study to look at the city of Alexandria and kind of the infrastructure readiness for implementing electric vehicle charging stations across the city. And that is all I have. So I'm happy to answer any questions on any.
Looks like Jim Capsis has his hand up.
I'm sure you're all shocked that I would ask a question on this particular topic. Hillary, I look forward to reading the EV readiness paper. I didn't know it was available, so I'll take a look at that. Does it take into account as well, potential infrastructure requirements? I assume it does not include Dash, because I know Dash has a separate sort of study that's in the pipeline as well. But I just wanted to get a sense of how the readiness study that you're referring to interacts with the work that Dash is also commissioning, since it's the infrastructure capacity, the hosting capacity for Dominion in the city is obviously a very relevant piece to the equation for us as well.
Yes, and it was just, I believe it actually was just posted today. So that is why if you clicked on the link I sent, it probably was not up yet. And what they have up there is it's a really high level presentation, and city staff will continue to work with both on this and then coordinating with Dash in terms of electric vehicle charging needs throughout the city. You know, if Dash were to look at locations other than the main Dash facility, that's something that we would all coordinate on, but I'm not sure to the extent of what this particular project, how that will evaluate transit charging, inline transit charging all throughout the city.
Any other questions?
I do not see any hands.
Thank you, Hillary. And we always have an opportunity as part of the board member reports is for any others who serve on boards, commissions, or organizations that they want to share. This would be the time to do that.
I do not
Anybody
see any
want
hands.
to be? Okay. All right. Thank you all. Next item, we'll turn to Josh for his general manager's report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to see everyone here on Zoom. This is certainly a challenging time for all of us, and I can tell you with great certainty that I'm sure everyone here has had their relative struggles with technology and figuring out how to conduct business. So I just want to first thank the staff that are on the call, Caitlin and Whitney, and many of the others on the team who have been working to put together this method for us to have this meeting. It obviously is something that we wish was just a simple click, but it certainly doesn't work that way in practice. So it's good to have a team out there that's working hard to make sure that we're able to conduct this meeting in accordance with the law. So obviously my report is going to speak a lot of obviously about our response to the coronavirus. Since the last time that we met in person, things have changed just by the day dramatically. Hopefully you all have had a chance to receive and review my weekly briefings, which is a tool that I felt was very important to help keep you caught up instead of ending up in a situation where we come to a board meeting and it's going to take 3 hours for me to explain everything that's going on. So if I skip over something that is of particular interest, please do not hesitate to jump in and ask me for additional information about that. But as I mentioned in my written report in the packet, this situation is unprecedented, and it's obviously something that no one here and many of the people before us never faced in their lifetime. And it's been really incredible to see people come together to respond to this and in the Alexandria community and throughout the world. Dash has been hard at work making sure that we're doing everything we possibly can do to respond to this and to do things in the most forward-thinking way, considering all of the input from public health officials and city officials, but also just what are the best practices that we've seen in the transit industry and considering what's going on. So we have gotten good feedback from our workforce that our response has been effective. We continue to see strong turnout of our frontline workers on a daily basis, which is excellent. We have had a number of cases or case concerns. Stephanie Salzone, who is here on the call with us, was appointed as the point person for Dash and leading and managing the response to this, and she's done an outstanding job in doing so. And Stephanie has developed a contact tracing process that she initiates with the team every single time we get a report of a case or a potential case. Fortunately, we've only had 2 confirmed at this point. Stephanie, shake your head yes or no if I'm saying that correctly. 2. We've had several others that are concerns, but in both cases where we had confirmed cases, they were not cases that came through Dash. They had gotten them elsewhere, and those employees, in fact, had not worked at our site. So within the time period of the incubation of the virus. So the one who got the sickest, I have spoken with, and he has been recovering well. He's excited to come back to work when he can. We kept in touch with him, and we were really happy to hear that he had an effective recovery. The other who is battling the virus right now was exposed through her son, or a family member, and that person had been out caring for the family member. So we've been supporting that individual as well, even though they didn't contract it at work. And every time that we have a report, we initiate our response process, which includes, beyond the regular disinfection, contact tracing, and disinfection processes of those vehicles if those individuals happen to use them. So all in all, we've been pretty fortunate at Dash. We hope to keep it that way, but we also recognize that it's inevitable that there will be cases in a workforce of 200 plus employees. And so the real focus for us has been helping the workforce understand how we respond to it when it happens, and how we can support them, and what the process is that they're expected to follow in the event that they exhibit symptoms and or are diagnosed with actually having COVID-19. Many of the other things I provided in my previous update, so I won't recap those to you, but I will say since my last update, we have fully implemented temperature checks upon reporting to the facility, and additionally, a set of questions that have been worked out by Stephanie and the team in coordination with the Alexandria Health Department to try to identify potential indications that are not temperature related as to an individual who might be at risk. And if they identify with any of those, they are sent home, they're compensated, and then we facilitate helping to get them tested if for any reason they have difficulty getting tested. So that's kind of what's going on with the virus. My management report here on page 9 of the document that was sent to you previously outlines some additional details, and I just want to talk about these, and Evan is going to recap these as well when he talks about the fiscal side of this. And that was really where we had our biggest concern in the long term, was the fiscal impact of this. To be candid, early on, it looked devastating for Dash. We were facing $2.5 million plus worth of combined revenue losses, city reductions, and so forth. The fundamental good news and the greatest part about this meeting is that we're not coming to you to ask you to do anything tonight. You don't have to make any tough decisions. We're really fortunate that the funding through the CARES Act has come in to solve this deficit for us. And in fact, it puts us in a position where we are prepared throughout the entire fiscal year 21 for the worst case scenario, and even into the following fiscal year, should it become necessary. So we have a long stretch here where we've got a safety net to help us with these revenue losses. But we still have to plan. So we've made some general assumptions, and I kind of explain what those are and that I've worked out with the team. I have asked the team to plan from a fiscal perspective to expect to remain fare free through Labor Day. I'll be honest with you, there's no real super science to that. There are a couple of factors though, one being that typically Dash is less heavily utilized in the summer months, regardless of a virus situation. Labor Day is a date we can all easily remember and think about, and we can tune ourselves to and make adjustments if needed. But it also provides us a window of time to continue to evaluate what's going on with the pandemic and what our response should potentially be to that. So we're continuing to monitor that, but that is one of the points that we're using as to make projections. We're also assuming that around that point, we're at about 50% of our normal ridership. To be perfectly frank, if the restrictions are, regardless of the restrictions being lifted, we know that people are going to be very slow to return to transit. It is an area where it has been proven over and over again that it's hard to maintain physical distancing in transit. Candidly, our bus ventilation systems are nothing like an airplane's, where they are filtering out fine particles. There are a lot of risks associated with transit in people's eyes as it relates to health and diseases. With that said, we know that people are going to ride anyway, and are going to need to because they have essential jobs. So while I say that we're going to assume that we're at 50% ridership, I want to be clear with the board that our team is ready to move to whatever level of service we need to move to at a moment's notice in order to be prepared for what changes. Our biggest challenge, though, as people start to move around again, is if we have to continue physical distancing, but there are more people trying to use transit, it means we have to put more buses out there and limit the capacity of those buses as we do today. We average about 10 people as a max capacity, although on our articulated buses, we can certainly get more people and maintain the physical distancing. The reality is that if we continue to see ridership increase, we're going to have to ramp up service more rapidly than the ridership would seem to call for on paper, again, to maintain that physical distancing. But we're going to keep an eye on that. But the reality of this also is we have to consider the fact that it's unlikely that Dash will reach its pre-COVID ridership in fiscal 21 and possibly beyond. It's going to be a long process. And if you think about planning this, and what we've done in planning this is to work backwards from when it is anticipated that a vaccine is widely available. And public health officials have made it very clear that that's a year out. And even though they're moving at a pace that's unprecedented, there's still a lot that's got to be done to get people vaccinated. And so we're just kind of using the vaccination point of March, April of next year as the point in which we think people will see it as fully safe to return to transit in full force. But again, that's a moving target, and that's something that we'll be continuously monitoring. The third item there that you'll see is I've asked staff to remain very aware of the fact that it is highly possible of a second wave, and to make sure that we know all the lessons we've learned from this initial shutdown, which candidly, I think we all did really well with, between the board stepping up, and thank you for your support early on and coming on and getting us the authority to move and make the changes that we needed to make, to the staff and the frontline staff who have had to make changes in what they do to ensure that we respond effectively to the crisis. We need to be aware that it is highly probable that there will be a second wave. And unfortunately, if you watch some of the news in areas where you've seen relaxation of the requirements, even as close here as in DC, in some situations where physical distancing is no longer followed, it brings great concern as to the viability of the virus resurfacing as a significant challenge. So those are some of the assumptions that I have asked the team from the planning side and from financial side and from the safety side to make sure that we're thinking about. These are, again, things to work with, but I wish I had a crystal ball and could say that this is how it's going to be. If everything that I presented to you is exactly right, I should probably be out there buying lottery tickets right now instead of what I'm doing. But we are hopeful that between combining the knowledge of all the resources we have locally and throughout the country and the world, and the information from the transit industry, that we're able to work with some reasonable assumptions here. So towards the end of that page 9 there, and then moving into page 10 of the written report, I note that with the introduction of the funding through the CARES Act, the scenarios of reduction, which are still explained, and I'll have a slide here for you on them in a moment, are no longer necessary. And for anyone listening in from the public and on Facebook, I want to be very, very clear that we're presenting these to you as the board so that you have an understanding of the magnitude of scope of what we would have been potentially dealing with if it wasn't for this legislation, and the fact that locally we were able to all work together, the city and Wamada and FTA, to really make sure that Dash had a piece of this money. So on the screen now, you'll see a synopsis of the two scenarios. And again, you'll hear about these again possibly later, but these give you sort of a snapshot of what we were looking at. as recently as weeks ago, while we were waiting to see what happened with the changes with the CARES funding, we anticipated a $2.23 million deficit, and this is essentially what that would look like. It is a huge blow to Dash to lose that chunk of money, but it would have substantial impacts on evening, weekend service, and West End service if we had to get as high as 2.9 million. So information only. I will, before I go on to ridership, I will pause to see if there are any questions on sort of what I've talked about thus far that I can help to resolve. Carrie, I see you there. Yeah, go ahead. Just gotta get you unmuted.
There we go.
There you go.
All right. So you were looking at, I just want to make sure I understand the 10,000 foot level on this. You were looking at about a $2.3 million shortfall, given the loss of ridership and revenue and the like. Is that correct?
That was combined, yes, along with a 400,000 reduction for the city. And then subsequent losses in regards to the ET2X as well. Okay, so that puts you probably around $3 million? No, those are all factored into these numbers.
Oh, so they're all factored in, okay.
Yeah.
And the CARES Act is gonna bring us 6.1, and so the delta between the two is the safety net that you referenced earlier?
That's right. And so what we looked at was what would be the situation if we remained exactly as we are all the way through fiscal 21. And the short answer to that, and I don't want to misspeak on this, Evan, if you want to chime in, is about 4.5 million, give or take, that we would end up consuming of that 6.1. Is that right, Evan? You can just shake your head. Or
if we didn't have any revenue in fiscal 21 at all, we'd be looking at about 4.8 million that we would have to make up. So there's still a bit of a safety net there.
All right, so there's a safety net there. Evan, take your tie off for Pete's sake. Do you wear that to bed?
Put it on just for the meeting, sir.
That's what I thought you'd say. All right, getting back to business, Josh, you referenced in your presentation that there's a lot of unknowns about ridership, about whether there's a second wave of this that we're going to have to confront, and so that safety net, I think, is going to be needed. We also heard, from Jim Durham, and I respect Jim's opinion a lot about, potentially using some dollars to implement, the first phase of the ATV. I would just recommend that going forward that we actually look at exercising a fair amount of caution because of the unknowns of ridership, the effect on revenue, the unknown regarding a potential second wave. And I'd hate to see us implement and use some of these dollars and basically that safety net is gone if we're looking at another shutdown, or if we're looking at a prolonged period of lack of ridership until we get a vaccine, and if we get a vaccine, depending upon who you're listening to. So again, just a little bit of a word of caution. We don't know if there's going to be more dollars coming, but we know we at least have some form of a safety net to guard the operation and to maintain at least what we have today.
Agreed. And I want to also point out, Carrie, that you made me think of this, that in the process of thinking about reductions, one of the items that we talked about as a team was, are there ways to bring the ATV into play? It kind of goes contrary to the idea of the ATV, which is to increase frequency and to provide the opportunities in its high traffic corridors. But also a part of what the ATV does, particularly in the Old Town area, is it reduces redundancies and duplicative routes. And so that was one of the items that was also considered and discussed as a part of the team And if you'd like to hear more about that, we can certainly have Martin chime in. But essentially, the idea being, are there pieces of the ATV that we've learned through all of the work that we did over the past 2 years that could potentially be used, even though they wouldn't get the frequency improvements, it might see routing improvements. So we certainly kept that as a consideration too.
And again, that's another option for you to consider. Should we get into more difficulties, more calamities associated with this? We have no idea what's going to happen in the future regarding the pandemic. But again, I want to echo. I think it's fairly safe to say, as you mentioned, Josh, that we are going to have a very slow return of ridership if it happens in the near future. Just because people's behaviors are going to change. Their dining behaviors are going to change, their entertainment behaviors are going to change, and quite frankly, their transportation behaviors are going to change. And I think, maintaining as much flexibility as possible on the fiscal side, but also on the operational side is going to be warranted at this point.
Agreed. And we are, another component of this has been the question of what's done with that residual money. And one of the things that was pretty clear about this act is that it must go to keeping transit jobs, transit service, and transit systems supported in regards to responding to COVID. It's very wide. The net they've cast is incredibly wide. You never see federal money be this flexible. Candidly, I wish it was all like this. But what they did say is that, look, if you need to hold this over into the following fiscal year, there really isn't a deadline on this to say you must spend it within a certain period of time. There is, though, a request in the region that if it becomes very clear that we're not using the entirety of it, that whatever we don't think we definitely won't need to be reallocated back towards other communities that might have a stronger need. But we certainly haven't even brought that conversation at this point.
So it's categorical in the sense that it is transit related, as
Correct.
Opposed to, it couldn't be used, the city couldn't use it to, offset a shortfall in another area, correct?
Nope. Okay. This is very specific transit only. Yep.
Well, it could, you could even be like in my industry where they put a sign on the door that said free money and everybody just sort of came to the bank. And that's exactly what we've been doing.
Wow.
It's called the PPP.
Jim is raising his hand.
Yeah, just a follow-up question on the CARES Act money. Is that what period is that? Is that just this year or is it beyond? I guess my question really has to do with, are we making any decisions in terms of how we're operating differently because we got the money that we might otherwise have made? And thinking about next year, because the two choices we don't have to make right now that you laid out, I would expect we will have to make a choice like that at some point. So understanding the flexibility of the money we have and whether that has to be spent in a period of time would be good to know.
Yeah, thank you. And Evan has been the expert within Dash on this and been living and breathing it. So I'll let him chime in here, but I would just offer to yield that to him. Are you good, Evan? Yeah, I see you unmuted. Okay.
Sure. As Josh was discussing, there's no formal expiration date for this funding. So, and OMB has actually made a really good suggestion in terms of how we use it, that on a quarterly basis, for instance, we might look at what our actual revenue loss is and then move in the CARES Act money at that time to meet that actual loss. So we're using it, really dollar for dollar to cover what we don't have, as time goes forward. Because there's no expiration, when we get to next summer, fiscal 22, if the pandemic is still continuing, if our revenue losses were less or more than what we think they're going to be, whatever's left, we can just continue to use, to meet that gap for Dash. Over the next several years, if our total losses exceed $6.1 million, then at that point, we're looking at greater choices. I mean, the biggest choice right now is, of course, do we cut service? And this funding prevents us from having to do that. As we learn more about the duration of this whole event, we may want to look at that in terms of just what our options are and what funding is available. But I guess that's how I look at it, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I would also add, Jim, that it's effective from the beginning of the pandemic. So, if we had losses, now fortunately the state DRPT allocated a chunk of funds, which was the initial way that we went fare free, and we knew that money would get us through this month. So we didn't even have to tap that CARES Act piece in this fiscal year. This current fiscal year is totally safe without any revenue coming in, and not having to touch the CARES Act at this point. And we'll get into that on the financial side, but I don't know. I guess Jim, I see Carrie also, but Jim, did you want to just circle back on?
Yeah,
that?
I'll wrap up and then yield to Carrie, or he can pile on. I guess my question is, when thinking about some of the work that I also do in my professional life, given what things are, every company right now is trying to figure out that this, how to extend their runway, particularly if you're an earlier stage business. And so when I think about the money that we have that has come in, how are you guys thinking about service cuts and scaling back? I know you've already done some pulling back of normal schedule for obvious reasons, but I would be interested in your team's view over the next several months, how you're thinking about what service levels should be. I guess what I'm saying is, while we all want everyone to come back, and we also have critical healthcare workers and others that need to use the service now, are there certain things we should be doing to extend that funding for the future, given that our tax base and everything else is likely to continue to get worse?
Yeah, I think if I'm interpreting your question correctly, it's sort of related to whether this money has to do with the service levels that we're putting out there. In a way, I'm not. So it's one thing that I would just say, is okay. So what we're running right now is a Sunday enhanced service, and that's based off of ridership. It's based off of what we expected to be the right service level relative to the stay-at-home order. We are seeing that the stay-at-home order is being moved to a safer at home order as of next Friday, assuming all goes well. So what does that mean? That could mean that there are more people attempting to use transit to make trips. We are proactively scaling up as we see those orders coming to bear, meaning if the governor is giving us this heads up that says, hey, we might lift the stay-at-home order next Friday, it's going to require some checks and balances. Our team is already saying, you know what, we're going to go ahead and be ready to start Saturday service a week from Saturday, for the very specific reason that what we don't want to do is we don't want to be behind the curve in responding to potential demand for service. But as long as the service demand remains low, we're going to keep the service low, and forgo throwing service out there just because we have the money to do it. I think that what I'm hearing both you and Carrie say, and you're on the same wavelength as me, is I think we need to be very cautious with this, and we need to make sure that this net is there for us to navigate a very uncertain future, because there are certainly a lot of questions still out there. So go ahead, Carrie. Yeah.
As a follow-on to Jim's point, it's a good one, and I want to sort of reinforce what Evan said a minute ago, and it really sort of relates to the sources and uses of these funds. I think it's important to recognize that these are one-time dollars, and we are using those for ongoing expenses, operating costs, and eventually, when those funds run out, we've got to fill. We potentially are going to have a big hole to fill if we've used them for operating expenses. And so, it's real important that the board remember that the source of these funds are one-time dollars. In other words, they're not going to come each and every year. We're able to bank them and use them for a while. And perhaps what Evan's suggestion about how to sort of book those expenditures so that we can show how they're being used as they occur, as opposed to, you know, doing a balancing at the end of the fiscal year is probably a more prudent course to take. But I do think that is important to bear in mind that you know, you postpone the inevitable and thus the pain if you wait and sort of count on these dollars as recurring revenues, because they're not going to be recurring revenue.
Right. Right. Okay, are there any other questions before I move on? I'm going to start talking a little bit about the ridership piece here, just to kind of cover that. Okay. So this slide here that I put up on the screen shows you very succinctly what coronavirus has done. And I would safely say that that you could take this chart and probably put it with any transit system in the country, quite frankly. You know, it has just been devastating as far as ridership. Now, we have seen sort of people out there riding, and I will be candid that we've fielded questions from our operators saying, why are we running, and when will we shut down, and what's the trigger for us to stop service? And you know, I've been very clear with them all along. We're an essential service, and we're there to move essential trips. And that's been our focus. Now, we are seeing a heavy use on the West End, and that's to be expected based on the income levels and alternative options that residents might have. So again, you know, this is significant, but the silver lining here is that this does not translate currently. This does not translate into dollars for us in the sense that we have a hole to fill. But to Carrie's point and Jim's earlier is we need to be recognizing that we've got to get back up. You know, once coronavirus is over, we've got to get transit back to where it was, and we've got to get our revenue ridership back to where it was, because these funds will not continue. So we're very, very aware of that, but I just wanted to share with the board sort of where that's sitting. So, you know, the last little bit of my presentation here, and you're going to hear more about ridership and fiscal stuff from Evan here in a little bit. But some of the other things we've had going on, as the chairman mentioned, we've been doing town halls. We've also increased the frequency of our employee newsletter to be a weekly newsletter as opposed to a monthly. We have also, I'm sorry, Ian, were you?
Yes, I did
Oh.
try to raise my hand.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, your video was off. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I wanted to mention, you talked about the forecast as of Labor Day. And I know we do have some of the CARES Act money as a safety net, but do we have a plan for, should this thing be extended through the fall? My concern is, even if by some miracle next week, Friday, the stay-at-home order is lifted, I don't see people running out there just to use the service because it was lifted a week from now. So I still think we should be cautious with respect to the way we spend.
Mm-hmm.
So my concern is, did we have a contingency plan? It might be in Evan's presentation, but.
Yeah, I think it's essentially, you know, the Labor Day is to me, the Labor Day is the point which I would be saying to the board, we should be considering reinstating fares potentially. Again, it's a big potential, but if we remain fare free and even operated full service for all of fiscal 21, is what Evan was saying, is that's where that I've already forgotten the number, 4.8-ish number comes into play of the amount of money that we would need to be able to sustain that. We know that that's unlikely. We do know, though, that what does come back is going to be way, way, way less than what we had before. I mean, we were finally on the upswing, you know. So that's our safety net. That's our contingency, if you want to call it that. But as far as the details and technicalities of what levels of service and what levels of fares and those kinds of things. We're keeping that very fluid right now.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes.
And certainly we can come back to it in Evan's portion too. And maybe if your question's still unanswered at that point, I'd be happy to jump in and maybe speak to it some more. That'd be helpful.
Yes, I know it's difficult because the city is dealing with the same thing since the CARES Act. There is no limit. So it's very difficult to put a limit on the spending.
Yeah. Well, and to be clear, from a budgetary perspective, our budget is being maintained exactly as it was already presented. We are not. So the other thing I would mention about the CARES Act is the CARES Act cannot be used for new projects or pet projects. It couldn't be used for if we suddenly said, oh, we want to add a new route because we got this extra money, we want to run that. The CARES Act is very specific that it is intended to mitigate the effects of coronavirus, and that we make sure that we're pointing back to that. So from a spending perspective, we've been very clear. I've been clear with the team, and the team has all understood. This is not a, oh, well, now we've got $6 million extra to play with, and we're just going to spend that willy-nilly. That hopefully that also maybe clarifies some things for you. It's very, very specific as to how we're going to manage that money.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just wrap up here. Just like I said, we've been doing a lot of outreach with the workforce. We've been spending a lot of time making sure that we figure out every possible way to keep them informed. We also rolled out a couple of other things this year. We had already been working on rolling out an instant messaging and automated telephone calling system, which we have utilized to keep the workforce informed. So when there is a case confirmed or an exposure confirmed, the team works together to quickly get out a message, and it goes to every single employee, informing them of what's going on. So a lot of transparency is a very important thing here for this. So lots of work there as far as keeping the workforce informed. We have done more videos, more instructional videos. We have to change how we communicate information, both to the public and to the workforce. We've been busy on our social media, keeping people informed with instructional videos. And we actually did Ray was the star of a video about how to properly use PPEs. And so we're very proud of the work we've been doing on that. The new signage has been installed on the buses on seats to delineate seats that passengers should not use. And that has been effective in helping passengers to understand. We've been active in the community, assisting the Carpenter Shelter and moving residents there, as well as we had a full bus of food that we worked with Alive for Alexandria to transport. And that information is in the written report. As Martin mentioned, we've held the TDP community meeting virtually, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention this is a great time of year typically for us when we're doing our dashing words in motion. So our team has been working to convey those over social media in lieu of the more traditional ways that we do the poetry. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to glance at my screen and see if there were any other movements, and I don't see any. I will ask if it's okay to turn it over to you to turn over to Evan.
Sure. Josh, can I just ask you one question on your report? Sure. You've mentioned in conversations we've had about how you've been staging extra buses. So when you do have, say, more passengers, then you can accommodate with the seats that are restricted, that you can fulfill that service. With the stay-at-home order potentially being lifted next week, is that going to change any of your operations in terms of how many of those buses you're using, you have ready, and are any of them actually going out and providing service, or is it just sort of so we have it and we're not leaving people behind? Just trying to get a sense, especially with your comment about the West End having had more demand for service.
Yeah, I'll answer the latter part of your question, and then I'll turn it over to Martin to answer the former part. But on the latter part, we've definitely been using the stage buses. I've noticed drivers calling to say that their bus is approaching capacity, COVID capacity, we'll call it. and dispatch moving those stage buses into place. They've also been used to cover shifts when workers have been unable to report out of either concerns or other medical related stuff. But Martin, do you want to answer any further on that regarding the future of the stage buses and how they're being accounted for?
Yeah, so Josh was right. We have been using them from time to time. The drivers will call them in or call in dispatch. Hey, I've got too many passengers, so they're being utilized a decent amount. I will note that as part of the governor's announcement about the stay-at-home order being kind of reduced, we are going to be kind of changing our service plan a little bit just to be proactive. We're basically trying to, it's a daily assessment between our operations and planning team to kind of look at ridership numbers, staffing availability, making sure that our passenger loads are where they need to be to comfortably maintain social distancing. So we're trying to be proactive with this change in the governor's order to make sure that we don't put ourselves in a place where we see a surge in ridership of any degree in 2 weeks from now, and that affects our buses being more crowded. So what we're doing is we're going to be increasing the baseline services provided, the actual scheduled buses. We're planning to move from enhanced Sunday to enhanced Saturday that weekend. Unless something changes dramatically with the governor's order, that's our plan, and we feel like that's a way to get ahead of any crowding issues we might have. That also puts us a little bit better in line with other agencies like Fairfax and Arlington, who are kind of at an enhanced Saturday as well right now. So we feel like that kind of puts us in a really good spot to address any crowding concerns.
Any other questions from the board? All right, we'll go ahead and recognize Evan then.
Good evening again, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My report begins on page 13 in the packet, and we have some slides that just walk through everything as well. Josh already covered these assumptions that we've taken in preparing the revenue forecast for fiscal 21. Just to recap them briefly, we're expecting somewhere around 50% of our otherwise projected ridership in September, and what we did is we just kind of slowly increased that up to 85% by June. Of course, we can't know whether those numbers are going to be the right ones, but we felt they were conservative enough for this fiscal year. And the good thing about the CARES Act funding is that if we've been too optimistic about the amount of revenue we think we're going to collect, there is some safety net there to continue to fill an even larger gap should that occur. And as Josh discussed, we're assuming that assumes no revenue at all until September after Labor Day, to provide relief to customers who are experiencing economic challenges during this time, to maintain the physical distance on the buses and keep passengers farther away from the bus operators, as well as to encourage, give a little bit of an incentive to return to transit should those stay-at-home orders be lifted. There is that room if we need it, if this is too optimistic a forecast, and we're just going to monitor this very closely, on a month-by-month, a week-by-week basis as we head into this fiscal year. Next slide, please. And so what this adds up to is a revenue gap of about $2.9 million. $400,000 of that is the reduction in the subsidy that was proposed as part of the city manager's budget 2.0, recognizing the incredible reduction in revenue the city as a whole is facing. The actual number of passenger revenue decline that we are assuming is just over $2 million. And then the other piece of this is, as I think everyone knows, we operate a contract service for the Department of Defense Washington headquarters service to the BRAC facility at Mark Center. And that gives us about just short of $900,000 a year. We're still waiting on the exact number for fiscal 21. And right now we're not receiving any revenue on that because we're not running that service. So the last bit of revenue we earned on that was in March. And we're not assuming we're going to have any more of that until that service picks back up whenever it does. So we've conservatively taken a 50% reserve, if you will, for that contract. And all that adds up to the $2.9 million. And of course, as we've discussed, in order to close that, if the CARES Act funding wasn't there, we would be proposing really extensive service cuts in order to balance our budget. Next slide, please. Just to give a little bit of background on the CARES Act, it's allocated $25 billion to transit nationwide, and Hillary spoke to this a bit already. Around $1 billion went to our region. Some goes to MTA in Maryland, some goes to PRTC because they're outside of the Wamada compact area, and Wamada got about $877 million. And that's because they are the designated recipient for our urbanized area. As part of the Wamada compact, all the other jurisdictions kind of, waived that ability to receive that funding. And so Wamada did not have to share that with the region. They did, understanding that was the clear intent of the legislation, and there was pretty clear guidance from the congressional delegations around the region. And so they used the same FTA formulas as if all of the jurisdictions in the region were formula recipients to allocate that funding, and they adjusted it a little bit for population as well, which kind of helped out some of the larger counties, and that got us to 6.1 million. To be clear, this does not mean that we're a direct recipient of an FTA grant, so the FTA compliance does not flow down to us. And as Josh went over, this is really intended to prevent those service cuts and job losses. And there's no expiration date, as we've discussed. And we will, again, just have to monitor very closely to see at what rate we're using this funding and how much is available. To get at some of the questions that were asked earlier, if this pandemic extends longer than we think it is, if the effect is, deeper than we think, we're going to have to look at that. But service levels. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The primary thing that we can do on the spending side is control our service level. And right now, we're running a reduced service, and where that saves us is in overtime, primarily, a little bit in fuel, and that's less now just because the fuel cost is so low at the moment. But that's overtime savings is what is enabling us to close fiscal 20 with a very small surplus, even though we're losing all of this passenger revenue. And because the state is giving us about $500,000. But, if there are points throughout fiscal 21 where we are running reduced service because the demand isn't there, or because, we have to go back into a lockdown type situation, that will help us a little bit on the expenditure side, primarily in overtime. So that would reduce the rate at which we're absorbing the CARES Act funding. Any questions before I continue further into my report?
Evan, just one on the Mark Center contract. Have there been conversations with DoD about under what circumstances they will, as to what when they will plan to resume it? Do they have to call back a certain percentage of their workforce to Mark Center, or how have we then gone about our assumptions for when we'll start getting revenue again?
Thank you for that question. Martin and I have been in close communication with our contacts at DoD. We actually have an agreement as part of our contract relationship with them that outlines what they call health protection condition levels, and then how that impacts what extent of their staff is reporting to the office, and then how that would impact our service levels. I'm not recalling all the details, but essentially as their workforce returns, our service would be scaled up, in close communication and coordination with them.
Evan, Larry Chambers has a request to talk.
Hi, all. Just a quick question, Evan. So we talked about having this safety cushion going forward in the face of all the unknowns we're facing. Is it possible that Wamada could recall that funding if it doesn't get used? And how likely is that to happen if we're holding on to it and other systems in the area are spending?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that that's technically possible. That being said, the Wamada board has approved these allocations. So I think it's unlikely that they would pull them back. And that's certainly the understanding that this has been given, to the regions to prevent job losses and service cuts among the regional transit services. I think what NVTC is really monitoring this for the Virginia jurisdictions. And, should we, for some reason, if we're not spending and if we're not incurring the losses, there's been some discussion, as Josh mentioned, about reallocating the money, if one jurisdiction isn't using any and one doesn't have enough to move that over, but there hasn't been any, formal criteria that have been put out related to that, or say a date, at which if you haven't used all your money by this date, we're going to redirect it somewhere else. There hasn't been anything like that. I think discussions about exactly how that's going to work are still ongoing at the level of the Wamada board and the representatives from the region. And there might be others in the meeting who might know more about that than me, but my understanding is that Wamada has made a commitment and there's no intention to claw back any of that funding.
I see Lisa with her hand up.
Thanks. I just wanted to support Evan with everything that he said, and also say that OMB is going to be working closely with Dash to strategize should we be told there ends up being a deadline or a date. That is why we were leaning towards the quarterly allocations, and we will do everything in our means to keep the full $6.1 million, even if that means we have to possibly utilize it for other transit related areas, like our paratransit contract, and then replace those dollars later. So great question, and we're working with Evan to make sure we continue to maximize all the dollars that's initially been awarded to the area.
Great to hear. Thank you both.
Thank you. If there's no other questions on this topic, we could move to the next slide.
Okay.
This is just kind of summarizing what we've been saying, that this really, it prevents the service cuts or reductions in workforce aside from the At4 segment, which was a part of the original budget process before COVID changes came into effect. It enables us to maintain our proposed fiscal 21 budget. If necessary, we can sustain reduced or no fares for a significant portion of fiscal 21 and maintain the enhanced cleaning and sanitizing procedures that we've put into place so far. And we are participating with the city's process of submitting those costs through the FEMA reimbursement process. Of course, it's very uncertain to what extent, the city would be reimbursed for those costs, but if there could potentially be some savings for those direct costs that we've incurred in cleaning and sanitizing and things like that.
Evan, I might this is an opportunity, if you don't mind, for me to highlight the fact that one of the conversations we've been having with the workforce and what we've recognized within the transit industry has been the innate danger that is presented by the design and the nature of the way the buses' ventilation systems work. As I mentioned in my intro, so one of the tasks that the team has been working on, and we've talked about a couple of times, has been how to improve those filtration systems and how to make the climate within the bus and the air within the bus more sanitary. It's a big challenge, but we're looking for opportunities. And so that might be another example of the type of thing that we would explore potentially using some of the CARES Act funding for. The CARES Act is also intended, as Evan mentioned, to help mitigate the effects of the virus. So looking at environmental options for the buses is one thing. The other that has come up frequently, I see you, Jim, is the question from the drivers, which has been the shields that are installed in some buses between the driver and the passengers. It's sort of a door that provides sort of a semi-secured compartment for them. You see these used primarily in areas with a lot of difficulties with crime, with attacks on bus operators, which has been a challenge within the industry. And fortunately, Dash does really well because we have a great relationship with our riders. We don't tend to have those kinds of issues. But my response to the workforce on that was that that's also something we're looking into. That is a much harder fix also. Those things are not cheap, and retrofitting an entire fleet of 100 plus buses is not something that you just wave a wand and do. But again, just exploring these mitigations that we may need to have in place in order to make people feel more comfortable returning to transit. So Jim, I saw you raise your hand there.
Thanks, Josh. I just wanted to follow up on the bus filtration issue. Could you provide a little more context on that? Meaning, how much of that is a dash specific issue? I guess how pervasive a problem is that in the entire bus transit industry? And are you aware of, alternative ventilation systems that are available that, one could include as a retrofit? One, and then two, as we think about future bus purchases, does the ventilation system exist that can be added into future buses?
Yeah. So again, answering your question kind of in reverse order, I think we have already decided that whatever we find as possible to improve these systems, we want to factor that into future buses. But it is a industry-wide issue. When I was younger, I was an intern as a mechanic, and I spent a couple of months learning that side of the industry. And I can tell you that the air filters that are on buses are essentially no different than taking a broom and holding it up against a vent. That's about the density of the filter media that are on the filtration systems of not just Dash's fleet, but the entire transit industry. Largely, the issue with more restrictive filters is the throughput requirements the systems have to draw a proper amount of air to draw down the cabin temperature or bring up the cabin temperature, the immense loads that are on the cooling systems and heating systems. But that's not an answer that we have stopped at. That's not the answer that we're accepting. In fact, we have had engagement with the HVAC manufacturers. We have engagements with the bus manufacturers. And quite frankly, in fact, Ray and I had a conversation with one just earlier in the week. And I said to him, I said, look, you know, as an industry, you guys are going to have to respond to this right now. You're already behind. We've got to have a solution. We've also got to potentially look at ways to isolate the driver's area's air, because the other thing that happens with the design of the ventilation systems is the same air that feeds the cabin is boosted through a series of booster fans from the same source. So it's drawn in at the back of the bus, pumped into the ceiling where there are vents, and it's dumped down along the walls of the bus, along the windows. And there is also a booster that blows it into the driver's area, and it's sucked back in the back of the bus, or in some cases in the front of the bus, depending on the orientation. So I recognize that, and I appreciate your comment, Jim. I just want to assure you and the rest of the board members that this is a very active conversation. I know that Ray is really our technical guy when it comes to these bus builds and the bus equipments. And I know he's had a couple of conversations, and certainly Ray, just real briefly, if you have anything to add that you've recently had developments on. I know we've been examining UV light, we've been examining those kinds of things. Do you have a real quick update on that?
Yeah, at this point, we won't, at this point, we don't know exactly what the total solution is going to be. We suspect it's going to be a combination of different improvements and different methods through the air, the HVAC system by means of improvements to filtration. There are some improvements that we can make that's available in the industry. And also we're looking at different systems that can effectively either remove or deactivate airborne viruses. There are different technologies out there, as Josh has mentioned, ionization, UV lights, all of those are being explored by, throughout the industry and ourselves as well. There is not quite a consensus yet amongst, within the industry of what is the most optimal, correct combination of technologies or approaches to use. So this is something we're staying on top of, and we're engaging actively with the OEMs and the technology providers in the industry.
Ray, would you also explain the Mirv number? You had mentioned filtration is measured by a number called a Mirv rating.
Yeah. So as Josh had mentioned, the return air filtration on board our buses is not that great. The filters on most buses throughout the industry are really the equivalent to a Mirv 2 rated filter. And in the Mirv rating, the lower the number is, the less filtration, the higher the number is, the higher the filtration. The filter in your house is a Mirv 13. there are opportunities for us to improve our onboard filtration from a Mirv 2 to a Mirv 7. And that Mirv 7 is where some of the manufacturers are telling us that this is really as much as the system can handle while still functioning.
Jim, it looked like you maybe had a follow-up question.
I was about to go get the filter out of my closet, take a look at it until Ray gave us the analogy.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you guys raising this. It's highly concerning. I mean, not just for us, right, but for public transit, certainly nationally, if not globally. If our ventilation systems in our buses are that much worse than what we have in our homes and worse than on the airplane, from a public confidence perspective, and making sure that we're just keeping people safe, that seems like a very big problem to solve. Anyway, for my part, I'm happy to, offline to be as supportive as I can on that issue, engaging the tech sector and others to see whether that is something that folks can, fix sooner than later.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And I want to assure you and the rest of the board that this is a very high priority for us. Our conversation quickly shifted into this subject as soon as we started to orient towards the re-implementation, how to get people back on transit, and anticipating the first question being very much a similar question to what's being asked of the airline industry. And clearly we are light years apart from where the airline industry is in their filtration technologies. And so I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful that we will see innovators come in and resolve this for us. And if any of you out there have the means, this might be a good sector to jump into to figure out solutions, because the transit industry must resolve this. And this is not just buses, this is subway cars as well. So sorry, Evan, we kind of robbed your financial, but I appreciate you yielding the floor to me for a moment to talk about that important subject. And I want to assure the board will keep you updated as we navigate that, and certainly see the CARES funding as an opportunity to help us advance that work.
Absolutely. We can proceed to the next slide. So this just is the summary table that's also in the board packet that goes over our budget. The total budget number is exactly the same as what was proposed to you before COVID hit. It does include subsidy reduction that was proposed by the city. You'll see the CARES Act funding coming in on the bottom half, which is revenue. The third revenue line is the CARES Act funding, which is essentially, we're saying that's the gap that we project. And so that's the CARES Act funding that would come in to fill that gap. And we've reduced passenger revenue and our charter revenue and the subsidy accordingly. We kind of discussed what this budget does, in earlier meetings, but just to remind everyone, it's about a 6% personnel increase, which, keeps in line with our collective bargaining agreement and our other pay scales in the organization, as well as our benefit cost increases from year over year, which our renewals came in pretty nicely over the last few weeks, kind of around 2% or so. So we should be in pretty good shape on benefits in the coming year. There's a 6.2% increase in non-personnel to cover what was originally a conservative diesel fuel forecast. We're likely to save considerable amount of money on fuel in the coming year if prices stay where they're at, but also recognizing the need for some added investments in things like repair parts, as we have a more diverse fleet, more bus types, and a need to maintain more parts, as well as the ongoing cost of rolling out more technology all the time, and the services that support that technology, particularly the real-time bus information for customers. So that's really the budget at 30,000 feet. Are there any questions I can answer about it?
I see Steve Kleist. Sorry, Steve. There's so many windows open on my screen. I was checking the different chats to figure out if we had missed anyone. So
thank you, Jeff. No, I just wanted to share with the group the issue of the driver enclosures, and from my industry experience, most properties that did this experienced problems with heavy heat loading in the driver's area, because the HVAC system is normally not designed to add additional air circulation in this enclosed area. So it'd be important when we move forward for a new design that the air circulation HVAC ductwork is added to try to alleviate that problem that other properties have experienced. And with regard to the filtration system, one of the issues, unlike a closed system in an aircraft, commercial aircraft, the air circulation and airflow within a bus or passenger car, when we were doing our studies with Homeland Security, essentially indicated that it was to be treated as an open system, which meant filtration was really a challenge. So there may be some diminishing returns after a while as to how you develop the filtration systems, but just some ideas to check with the vendors or other company agencies that have done some work in this area might be of value.
Thank you, Stephen. That actually reminds me of the thought I had was about evaluating positive pressure within the cabin to see if there's a way to design the systems to put more pressure going out so that it's pushing excess air out the door or out the windows as opposed to drawing it in. I don't know whether that's possible, but.
It's problematic only because of the configuration of the bus. It's again, unlike a commercial aircraft, you're not dealing with a confined space in the cabin design. So it would require a fairly large output of the fan, but it's the same principle behind a clean room. But if you can get to that level, it would certainly make that strategy more effective.
Thank you for your insight. Appreciate that. Okay, I'm just checking the chat here. I don't think I missed anyone else.
All right. The remainder of my report is on pages 16 through 18 of the board packet, and that includes the balance sheet, the income statement, and the budget versus actual report. And they really paint the story that Josh outlined for us earlier, which is that we're going to close fiscal 20 very close in terms of revenue versus expenditure, made possible really by the non-essential spending freeze, a little extra state money, and a reduction in overtime and fuel costs. You know, it could be plus or minus, you know, $20,000 or something like that. And a key thing that I would point out is that we're way under budget in both revenue and expense. So we're in no danger of running out of budget, you know, the ability to spend money or appropriation, we might say. You know, whether our fund balance goes up or down, you know, a very small number at the end of the year is a little bit hard to say, but in the grand scheme of things, we're doing okay in fiscal 20. So that's the conclusion of my report, unless there are any other questions.
I see Larry's hand up.
Hey, I have just one more. I'm sorry, this isn't a finance question or a budget question so much as going back to the filtration issue. You know, just thinking about this, if we do end up getting, you know, if they do start developing these more higher end filters, I imagine they're going to cost a lot more as well. And I just want us to be mindful that we should really probably be aiming our safety goals at what the actual threat is. And I think as of now, the science on COVID, the one that we're actually facing down, I don't know that any filter is really going to help us here. As carried in droplets, there's not evidence or minimal evidence that it's being aerosolized. So I would just recommend being mindful of that as we make any decisions if filters do become available.
Thank you. I appreciate that balanced approach. I think that will be one that will certainly be a large part of our conversation.
Sorry, just can I just comment for 1 second?
Yeah, sure.
Again, and I'm not going to pretend to be the sort of expert on droplets, but maybe someone else here is. But I at least have read one story out of China that got a lot of coverage about air conditioning in a particular restaurant, and how the system actually did move droplets from one part of a restaurant to another part of a restaurant and infected people that were not within 6 feet of each other. So not to say that that is accurate necessarily, but I guess my point is that it's not clear to me that droplets cannot travel through ventilation systems. But I would again ask the Dash team to look into that. just because I think it's I don't feel like that's a resolved question, at least not for me.
I don't think it's resolved for anybody. I agree.
Yeah, I was going to say Matt, and also we have Stephanie on here. She might also have a little bit of insight. But Matt, do you want to follow up to those questions?
Well, yeah, just a quick follow-up. I mean, have we done a cost analysis between these systems which would be in place for the duration of the bus being in service versus just paying for masks for the riders so that the spread is mitigated somehow?
Certainly a good idea, and certainly something we could evaluate. I think to this point, that wasn't a path we've been taking largely because of supply challenges and the logistics of giving those out. But a good point, and certainly one that we would carry. I just also related to that, I would just offer the floor maybe briefly to Stephanie if there's anything we've missed, because like I said, Stephanie has been very active in the communications locally with the health department and others as our lead. Do you have anything? Have we missed anything, Stephanie? Is there anything you might add to some of the remarks from the board members?
Well, I just want to clarify that we are doing a lot of research into how this travels, as is the entire world right now. And I think the point of us really looking into this ventilation or the modifications that we can make is being proactive to that research coming out that it can travel through a ventilation system. There is some research that has come out of China that, not to get too scientific, but they have found RNA in aerosol version of this virus. The question is whether you can become infected by it. And that's where the research is still happening. So I just want to say that all the work we're doing right now is trying to be proactive. So if that research does come out, we're already in front of it.
Thank you. And I think these are all great ideas. So we'll certainly take all of these thoughts and the mask idea and whatnot, and weighing those options back to the team conversations, Matt and Jim and Larry and Steve. So thank you. All right, Mr. Chairman, I think Evan, we took over, but you yielded also. So
yep,
you're okay with us. Okay.
So we'll move on to the board officer nominations. A committee was appointed at our March meeting consisting of Ian Greaves and Steve Kleiss to determine officers of our board and the corporation. And just for those of you who are new, our bylaws state that every year at the board meeting after the stockholders meet, the council members to reappoint the board members, that we essentially reorganize and identify who will be the officers of the board and corporation. And so we had a 2-member nominating committee to run through that. And so I'll ask either Ian or Steve if you want to run through your recommendations. And I believe there was a correction that Kelly sent out to what was in the packet, which we should all have via our email.
Sure, and I'm displaying the corrected version, I think. Hopefully, Ian, you tell me if I'm displaying the wrong version. Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, if it's okay, if I could weigh in at this point. With Kerry Donnelly's departure or original departure, we placed my name in as the vice chairman. However, since Kerry will be staying over for a bit longer than anticipated, I defer to the board's preference as to whether he would like to be retained in that position or whether the proposed slate is acceptable.
Kerry's got his hand up.
I appreciate Steve's comments. However, if the board should act to retain me as the vice chair, I will move to Canada and fight extradition.
Duly noted.
Already. Are there? Steve, I appreciate those comments. I don't know some of the positions that you face, in terms of staffing them. Our bylaws actually dictate that someone, a particular person at the ATC or a particular person in the city would hold those positions. And so really kind of the determining who you wanted to recommend as the board chair and the board vice chair are the kind of primary decisions that have to be made as part of this. I thank you both for your work. Do any of the board members have questions or comments? And certainly if there are other nominations that you want to make, this would be the appropriate time to bring those forward as well. If not, then we can entertain them.
Yeah, I don't see
I heard
anybody.
somebody
No, yeah, no one's hands are up. I'll just let you know that, yeah.
And then if not, then it would be appropriate to entertain a motion to adopt the officers who would serve until the next stockholder meeting in winter of 2021. Would somebody like to make a motion?
I move approval of the officers listed by the nominating committee.
All right, moved by Lisa. Is there a second?
Second.
Ian? Okay.
That was Ian, yeah.
If there's no further discussion, then we'll go ahead and vote and ask that anybody who is either voting no or abstaining to make that known. Hearing silence, then we will assume that the slate is adopted unanimously. I thank the nominating committee and the board for reappointing me as the board chair. I have very much enjoyed serving with all of you and look forward to another year. And Steve, I look forward to having you as the vice chair. You are our second longest serving board member at this point, and you had a long career with New Jersey Transit and then the Surface Transportation Board, and you, as you have tonight, bring a lot of expertise on the transportation industry. So I appreciate you agreeing to be the vice chair with Carrie's impending departure. So the next order of business we have is future meetings, and Josh had put a recommendation in our packet just in terms of how we handle the special meeting that was to be called for May 27th, and then the June meeting in light of some guidance that the city attorney had put out in terms of when city boards and commissions should be convening during these next couple of months in light of staff time that's required to bring these meetings together, and in terms of some barriers that this poses to members of the public participating, especially if there are issues in terms of technology and connectivity. I would share that Josh and I had a subsequent conversation after the board packet had come out just to kind of flesh this out a little further. And the recommendation, and Josh, I'll invite you to chime in as well, that we want to offer is that we would have the meeting on May 27th that we had already kind of reserved a Zoom call-in for. And the purpose of that meeting would be primarily to adopt the TDP and budget and to act on the board selection committee's recommendation, just so we have a lot of time in terms of flexibility in terms of dealing with council's schedule for when they can convene to ratify that recommendation. And then we would go ahead and cancel the June meeting. We have heard, we have board staff have completed their outreach on the budget and TDP, and we had our hearing tonight. We didn't have any speakers. We're in a good position, so we feel that we probably don't need to extend that adoption into June. And in that way, we are minimizing the number of meetings we have in terms of not getting together in June. We would still have the option to meet in June. So if there was something, especially something COVID related, because the state of emergency that we had granted to Josh expires on June 10th, that we would then be able to meet in June to act on anything. But if there is nothing urgent that comes up, that we would cancel that meeting. Josh, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes, and I would also, it looks like Larry was maybe raising his hand. You're good. Okay. No, I think we're in total agreement, and I appreciate Chairman's conversation, and I think this is in line with the guidance that was issued by City Council. This came out somewhat after my packet or simultaneously to that, and so this adjustment just kind of falls in line. And I think the idea is that this could change depending on the course of the virus, but it is a wise act. And we have managed to pull together this meeting, but as you can all tell, it just is not as smooth or fluid, and it certainly does not provide the accessibility that we would like to always make sure we do have. So the other thing that I would say is we will keep a close eye on the guidance of health officials. I know that council is considering, as I think maybe in June or July, moving to a partial in-person attendance where seemingly, I guess, part of council, and I don't know, Hillary, you're back. I see you've been following the council actions, or Lisa want to tie into this, but we could potentially look at doing something similar for Dash where we maintained, did a Dash facility, for example, where we have that large room and spread out tables, but we'll certainly keep all of that, tabs on all of that as far as the best way to get back to some sort of a normal meeting, or at least a meeting where it is more generally accessible for individuals who need to access the meeting. So I didn't know if, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if it's okay to just check with Hillary and Lisa as to whether it was city staff, whether there was any additional thoughts.
Yeah, Josh, you had it right. My understanding was in June, they were going to go back to what they did before we were all virtual, which was having quorum in place in council chamber and the remaining council members participating via phone or Zoom.
Okay.
So I don't think this requires what's a board action to make a decision. I don't think it requires a formal motion, though, just as long as there's general agreement as to how we will conduct our meetings for the remainder of the spring. Does anyone have any comments or want to suggest a different approach?
I do not see any hands.
Okay, then we will go ahead with our May 27th meeting, and we'll have any other, in addition to the budget TDP and the board member nominating committee, we'll certainly have updates on the COVID situation and Dash's operations as well.
And I will certainly continue. I'll continue my weekly briefings. I didn't send one this week because we already had this meeting. But any updates that we have between now and the 27th, we'll make sure we include in the briefings.
And thank you for those briefings. They have been very, very helpful. Also, I've found I get questions sometimes from members of the public who know of my service on the dashboard, and so being able to provide some of those so that way they are hearing directly from the source and those who are immersed in the operations. It's very helpful, and it's organized and formatted very well, and it's easy to follow, and the images are great as well. So good job to your staff who have been helping to put those together and keep us informed. Is there any other business that needs to come before the dashboard tonight? If not, then I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved, Mr. Chairman, provided that Evan takes his tie off.
And Mark Carey.
I'll second.
Jim?
It sounded like it was Matt, maybe.
Oh, Matt. Okay. I saw Jim come up on my screen. So seconded by Matt. All in favor?
All right.
Oh, right.
Aye.
Anyone opposed should make that note. Nobody's opposed. Thank you all for your patience tonight with me and for your participation this evening. I hope all of you are well and your families are well, and I look forward to convening with you in a few weeks.
Thank you.